Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
I almost turned the car around halfway there. Traffic was crawling. My left contact lens felt like sandpaper, and I'd already changed my outfit 3 times because somehow nothing said successful but humble daughter returning home to face her father's ego quite right. It had been 6 months since I last stepped foot in that house, a beige colonial with the same cracked driveway and perfectly trimmed hedges that made it feel more like a display model than a home. I pulled up right on time. Not early, not late, because God forbid I show any extremes that might invite more commentary than the usual underhanded remarks my dad liked to dish out between bites of meat and mouthfuls of disappointment. Walking up the steps, I adjusted my jacket, took one breath deep enough to hold back 10 years of resentment, and rang the bell. My mother answered, wiping her hands on a dish towel like always, smiling in that soft, distracted way she did when she knew an evening might go sideways, and was already bracing for the cleanup. She hugged me, told me I looked healthy, which in mom language meant she wasn't sure if I'd gained weight or just looked tired, and led me into the dining room where everything was set like it was Thanksgiving, even though it was just my dad's 67th birthday. The table was a damn museum piece, heavy oak, polished until it practically glared at you. At one end sat my father, Frank, retired contractor, proud homeowner, and lifelong subscriber to the idea that if you couldn't touch it, build it, or rent it out, it wasn't worth the damn. He was in his usual uniform, polo shirt tucked into slacks, reading glasses on the tip of his nose, half glass of Merlot already in hand. On his left was my brother Eddie, always with a slight smirk like he knew something I didn't or had just heard a joke he wasn't gonna explain. He owned a local landscaping company that my dad helped him start, which Frank loved to bring up every time anyone under 40 said the word entrepreneur. I sat down at my place, the kid's seat, as Eddie still liked to joke, even though I was 37 and probably paid more in taxes last year than he'd grossed. But tonight, I wasn't going to argue. I didn't come to pick fights. I came to eat, smile, maybe compliment mom's potatoes, and get the hell out before the wine turned into lectures. The meal started harmless enough, small talk, mild jokes, the kind of banter that just barely covers the tension in a family that loves each other, but doesn't really like each other all the time. Frank asked Eddie about business, and Eddie gave a proud update about some new contract with the school district, nothing huge, but enough to get Dad grinning like he'd just been told his name was going on a new stadium. I smiled politely, nodded, offered a "that's great" when needed. No one asked what I'd been working on, and I didn't offer it. I'd learned over the years that giving updates about anything involving websites, data, or remote teams only invited blank stares or dismissive comments about how that's not real work. About 15 minutes into the meal, just as I was spearing a green bean that tasted like it had been boiled during the Bush administration, my phone started vibrating on the table. I usually turn it off during dinners like these, but something told me to leave it on this time. I glanced at the screen, and sure enough, it was Veronica, my realtor. Not just a friend helping me house hunt, but a sharp-as-hell, no-nonsense broker who'd just helped me close on my second commercial property. Tonight's call was about the third. I looked at the name, then at my dad, then casually said, "Excuse me a sec," and answered the call with my phone still on the table, speaker on low but not low enough. "Yeah, Veronica? Everything good with the paperwork? Cool. Yeah, third building should be smooth if the zoning stuff clears by Friday. I'll wire the remainder in the morning." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The silence that followed was immediate and thick. You could hear the tick of Mom's kitchen timer in the background, like the second hand itself was holding its breath. Eddie stopped mid-chew, eyes flicking to our father, whose fork was frozen in midair like someone had just told him the house was on fire. Mom blinked 3 times, but said nothing, reaching slowly for her wine like it was a life raft. For a full 10 seconds, no one spoke. Then I ended the call with a cheerful, "Thanks, talk soon," and looked up just in time to catch the look in my dad's eyes, the same one he used to give me when I dropped a fly ball at Little League. Confused. Disappointed. A little bit angry. I wasn't trying to show off. I hadn't planned this moment like some smug gotcha. But I'd spent so many years at that table pretending to be smaller than I was just to keep the peace that, When the moment came to speak up, accidentally or not, I didn't flinch. I saw it land, and I let it sit. My dad finally spoke. He leaned back slowly in his chair, swirled his wine like he was swirling a thought around in his head, and said, "You bought another. What? A house?" I smiled, not wide, not smug, just enough to match his tone. Not exactly. Eddie let out a dry chuckle, like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Wait, hold up. What do you mean third building? Like, apartments? I looked at him, then at Dad, then at my plate. The steak was overdone, but it didn't matter. I just dropped something better than seasoning on that meal. I cut another bite, slowly, deliberately, and said, commercial property. Strip mall, actually. Great anchor tenant already in. Passive income solid. And then I took the bite, chewed, and swallowed while the whole table watched me like I'd just turned into someone else. What none of them knew, what they were just beginning to suspect, is that I'd been building something all along, in silence, in the dark under their noses. And now the foundation was too strong to ignore. And this dinner was just getting started. It didn't take long for the mood to shift from stiff awkwardness to something colder, something sharper, the kind of tension that doesn't shout but stretches out across a room like fog rolling in over a field just before a storm. And I could see it in the way my father leaned back in his chair and slowly folded his hands over his stomach, as if collecting himself before delivering some philosophical speech that would put me back in the box he preferred me to live in, quiet, small, and unthreatening. He had that look again, the one that meant he was about to talk down to me but do it with a tone so even and so full of what he believed to be fatherly wisdom that questioning it would only make me look defensive or, worse, ungrateful. He picked up his wine glass again, stared into it like it might hold a better version of reality at the bottom, and then said, "Look, I'm not saying what you're doing isn't impressive. I mean, hey, good for you. But there's a difference between making a little money online and building something real. Something that lasts." My mother, who was in the middle of spooning more potatoes onto her plate, paused mid-motion. Her hand frozen like she wanted to intervene but couldn't quite find the nerve to interrupt the beginning of what she probably knew would turn into one of Frank's monologues. Eddie looked mildly amused, like this was just a rerun of a show he'd seen too many times, and I could already tell that any attempt to defend myself would be dismissed as overreacting or too sensitive or, worst of all, not understanding how the real world works, a phrase my dad wielded like a badge of honor every time he felt the edges of his authority fraying. He went on, not with anger, not with cruelty, but with that slow, steady, insistent certainty of a man who had built his worldview from poured concrete and roof shingles and thought anything that existed on a screen was as fleeting as fog in the morning. "Ideas are great," he said, slicing into a steak with methodical precision, "but you know what happens to ideas when the market tanks? They disappear. You know what doesn't disappear? Property. Land. Doors. Rent checks. That's real success. That's ownership. That's what puts you on the map. Everything else? Just noise." I didn't say a word. I just looked at him, looked at the creases in his face, the sun-worn skin, the hands that had held hammers and signed contracts and pointed at things that needed fixing for 40 years. And as much as part of me wanted to yell, to list the numbers, the returns, the fact that I made more in Q1 this year than he probably made in his best year as a contractor, I knew that none of it would matter, not because it wasn't true, but because it didn't match his definition of truth. His rules were written in concrete, and anything that didn't come with dust, sweat, or a goddamn deed in the glove compartment wasn't worth respecting. But while he talked, my mind slipped backward, uninvited but relentless, to a memory I hadn't thought about in years, me at 25, fresh off a failed Kickstarter campaign. Crying in the driver's seat of my rusted Corolla in a grocery store parking lot because I just maxed out my last credit card trying to build a subscription box startup that no one wanted. I remembered calling him, asking no, begging for a small loan, just enough to get me through the month. And I remembered the silence on the other end, the way he cleared his throat before saying, "Maybe this is your sign to stop playing around and get serious. Real life isn't a tech pitch, Nat." That was the last time I ever asked him for anything. Back at the table, Eddie chimed in, doing that thing he always did where he tried to translate Frank's rigidity into something more palatable, like a son trying to soften his father's blows so they didn't bruise so obviously. What Dad means is, it's easy to get excited about numbers on a screen. We just want to make sure you're protecting yourself, you know? Not getting caught up in the hype. I looked at him, the man who'd been handed a turnkey business, who'd never once had to prove his worth outside of the family name, and I almost laughed, not out of mockery, but out of the sheer absurdity of being lectured on risk by someone who thought payroll was a formality and profit margins just meant you had enough left over for a new boat. Still, I didn't react. Not yet. Instead, I reached for the bottle of wine, topped off my own glass with a steady hand, and said, "It's not hype. It's called cash flow. And I protect myself just fine." There was a pause, not long, but thick with implication, like everyone was waiting to see if the air would break open or stay sealed tight. My mother cleared her throat, then asked if anyone wanted more carrots, a peace offering in the form of overcooked vegetables. No one answered. I wanted to let it go. I really did. But something inside me, something I'd worked hard to smother for years, began to stir. The version of me that remembered the way my father would talk about Eddie's work ethic, even though I worked longer hours, made tougher decisions, and never once relied on anyone else to make my vision happen. It was the same version of me that had spent most of her 20s swallowing her voice so she wouldn't seem difficult, that kept her success quiet so it wouldn't sound like bragging, that learned how to play dumb just enough to stay liked. But tonight wasn't about being liked. So I turned my gaze to Eddie and asked, "Do you even know what a cap rate is?" His mouth twitched, like he wanted to laugh, but wasn't sure if I was joking. I didn't wait for an answer. I kept my tone calm, even casual, like we were discussing the weather. Capitalization rate. You calculate it by dividing the property's net operating income by its current market value. It's how you determine how fast an investment will pay you back. I run that math before I even look at a property now. It's not about owning land for the sake of it. It's about how fast that land pays you. The silence that followed was longer than before. And I realized in that moment that they weren't just surprised. I had stepped out of the role they'd written for me, and they didn't know who the hell I was anymore. I sipped my wine and smiled, not out of smugness, but out of relief. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to be one of Frank's rules. I was rewriting them. The moment my father's knife clinked against his plate with a bit more force than necessary, I knew he was on the verge of recalibrating, not because he was truly interested in learning anything new, but because I had done something unforgivable in his eyes. I had dared to prove him wrong without raising my voice, without posturing, without even trying to win. I had broken one of his invisible house rules, never outshine the men at the table, and done it with such casual indifference that it shook the foundation of the little power structure he'd spent his life carefully stacking like a row of bricks he was convinced only he knew how to lay properly. The silence that followed my cap rate explanation wasn't just discomfort, it was disruption, the kind that unearths more than it intends to, like when a contractor starts digging for a pool and hits an old septic tank no one told them was buried there. Frank picked up his napkin, dabbed the corners of his mouth like some kind of judge preparing to deliver a ruling, and leaned slightly forward, elbows on the table. Hands clasped together in that performative way he used when he wanted to appear reasonable, but was really just sharpening the knife of whatever came next. "I'm not saying you don't know your numbers," he said, his voice lower now, slower, like we were entering negotiation territory, "but there's knowing a formula, and then there's knowing how to hold on to something when it starts bleeding money. I've seen more people go broke on commercial real estate than I can count. One bad quarter, one bad tenant, and suddenly you're holding a mortgage on a strip mall with no foot traffic and a subway that can't make rent." I could feel Eddie nodding beside him, that familiar echo of approval that always came when Frank threw out one of his back-in-my-day lessons, and for a moment, I almost let it pass. I almost let them slide back into the illusion that they understood more because they had failed first. But then I remembered the numbers I had run this morning, the spreadsheets color-coded down to the last decimal, the leases signed under my LLC with net terms that would make a CPA whistle. And I realized I wasn't about to let another man talk to me like I was some eager intern playing Monopoly with Daddy's cash. So I leaned back, took a slow sip of water, and said, "You're right. Bad quarters happen. Which is why I bought in cash." That landed like a dropped wrench on a tile floor, sudden, heavy, and impossible to ignore. My father's eyes narrowed, not in disbelief, but in that calculating way a man looks when he realizes the opponent across the table isn't just bluffing, but holding the better hand. Eddie furrowed his brow, mouth half open, trying to make sense of it, like he couldn't quite compute what I'd just said because it didn't fit into the framework he'd built for me in his head, the framework labeled, "tries hard, but mostly lucks out." "Cash," Frank repeated, as if the word itself might transform into something else if he said it slower. "As in no loan? No bank involved?" "No debt," I said, calmly, as if we were still talking about carrots and potatoes. "No partners. No liens. All mine. Triple net lease already in place. 10-year term. Escalating annual rate. Anchor tenants of pharmacy, healthcare, stable, recession-resistant. The plaza's an AB+ neighborhood with strong commuter flow. And I just got pre-approved zoning for a drive-through kiosk on the corner lot. Passive income. No surprises." You could almost feel the air change, like someone had opened a window in a sealed room, and, for the first time, it wasn't me suffocating, it was them. My father shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable, not because of anything I'd said, but because everything I had just listed were words that belonged in his world, not mine. I had crossed the barrier. I hadn't just dabbled in his kingdom, I had conquered part of it without asking for his blessing. Then my mother spoke, and it was only a whisper, but it hit the table like a verdict. "Frank," she said, her voice soft and hesitant, "she owns more than we ever did." For a moment, I thought maybe she'd regret saying it, maybe she'd backtrack or try to soften it with one of her usual passive pivots about how times were different now and everyone has apps and side hustles. But she didn't. She just looked down at her plate, fork still in her hand, like the weight of her own realization had finally settled in after years of watching me be underestimated in silence. Frank didn't respond immediately, but the twitch in his jaw, the way his left hand curled slightly into a fist, told me everything. This wasn't just a bruise to his pride, it was a rupture in his identity. His daughter, the one who used to forget to put gas in her car, who once got scammed on a freelance gig for $2,000, had gone and built something in the shadows of his approval, and now it stood tall enough to block his son. Eddie tried to jump in, maybe sensing the need to redirect the energy before it turned into something uglier. "Well, I mean, it's different now," he offered, gesturing vaguely with his fork. "All this online stuff, crypto, dropshipping, whatever. It's easier to scale. Not like it used to be. You couldn't build this kind of thing without putting in 20 years. I didn't laugh, because I knew it would kill the moment, but I let myself smile, just enough. "Easier?" I said, raising an eyebrow. "I built my first duplex with affiliate revenue from a skincare blog I started while waitressing. The site crashed 6 times in 1 month, I had to learn to code from YouTube videos, and for 3 years I didn't take a vacation because I reinvested every dime I made. You think that's easy?" Eddie had the decency to look mildly embarrassed, but I wasn't done. "My tenants pay on time. My cash flow's automated. And while you were buying that second boat," I looked at him pointedly, "I was putting 20% down on a multi-unit zoned for mixed use. I'm not here because it was easy. I'm here because I didn't give up when it was humiliating." There it was again, that silence. But this time, it wasn't uncertainty or disbelief. It was recognition. For years, they had written me off as the dreamer. The one with a million ideas but no anchor. The one who didn't follow the blueprint. But what they never understood was that I didn't need their blueprint. I built my own. And now it stood, brick by brick, deed by deed, proof that the world didn't just belong to the loudest man in the room. It belonged to the one who learned to build quietly. There's something profoundly disorienting about watching the faces of people who once dismissed you begin to flicker with uncertainty, as though the reality they built around themselves, the hierarchy they carefully maintained, had finally been challenged by something they couldn't explain, measure, or easily dismantle, and that flicker, that small but telling shift in their expression, was precisely what I saw taking root in my father's face as he pushed his half-empty wine glass slightly. Farther from him, not in defeat, not even in anger, but in the quiet, bitter recognition that a truth he had long refused to believe had just walked into his house and made itself at home at his table. My mother, still holding her fork in midair like she couldn't decide whether to eat or intervene, glanced at me and then at Frank, her eyes full of something I hadn't seen since I was a child, something close to fear but more complex. Maybe a dawning awareness that things weren't just changing but had already changed, and there was no putting the genie back in the bottle, no stuffing the truth back into the polite silences we'd all grown so accustomed to accepting over the years. Frank finally broke the silence with a scoff, not loud, not theatrical, but enough to reset the atmosphere in the room, and then leaned back in his chair, interlaced his fingers behind his head like he was settling into an old habit, and said, "Look, I get it. You've done well for yourself, Natalie. I'm not trying to take that away from you. But you have to understand that this," he gestured vaguely toward me, "the table, the world at large, this doesn't mean you've figured out everything. It just means the economy's been good to you. The timing worked out. Hell, I've been through enough recessions to know luck when I see it." The words didn't sting, not anymore, not after years of being the cautionary tale whispered about at backyard barbecues or family gatherings. Natalie, the one who's always working on something, Natalie, the one with the websites, the startups, the projects, as though my entire adult life had been one long game of pretend, a prolonged adolescence filled with cute distractions rather than actual work. But tonight, I didn't come to bite my tongue, and the time for giving them the benefit of the doubt had long passed. So I set my fork down with deliberate care, folded my hands in front of me, and said in a voice so level it could have been mistaken for casual, "That's fair. You've seen a lot. You've survived a lot. But I have too. Just in different ways." Frank raised an eyebrow, clearly sensing there was more coming, and maybe for the first time that evening, he was actually listening, not because he wanted to, but because something in my tone had shifted into unfamiliar territory. And when control starts to slip away from people like him, their ears perk up whether they like it or not. I continued, eyes steady, voice calm. "You talk about ownership like it's sacred. You talk about assets like they're a shield against failure. But what you never talk about, what you never admit, is the parts of your story you've kept quiet. The parts that don't look like winning." Frank's smile dropped, not entirely, but enough for the cracks to show. "You talk like you built this whole life on discipline and hard work and making the right calls, and maybe some of that's true. But you forget, Dad, I used to help Mom with the bills. I used to get the mail. I know about the second mortgage. I know about the time you almost lost the house in 2009. I know about the payday loan in 2011 and the refinancing you did behind her back." Eddie froze, fork halfway to his mouth, his eyes widening as though he had just seen a ghost step into the room. Frank stiffened, color draining slightly from his face, and for a moment, no one breathed. "I never said anything," I went on, my voice quieter now but no less clear, "because I figured it wasn't my place. You were proud. You were trying to protect something, your legacy, your image, I don't know. But it always struck me as strange that you could be so quick to judge the way I built something when your empire was leaking behind the drywall." My mother, pale and silent, looked down at her plate with a kind of shame that wasn't directed at me but at the years she'd spent holding together a story that was never quite whole, and as she sat there, her shoulders hunched slightly like someone bracing for cold wind, I felt an old, familiar ache rising, one that I had buried so deep I forgot it was still there. The ache of being the only one in the room who saw the truth, but being told to keep it quiet because it would make things worse if I spoke it out loud. "You want to talk about success?" I said, louder now, not angry but finally unfiltered. "You want to talk about real ownership? Then let's talk about 2019. Let's talk about the letter I got from the county about a pending foreclosure on your landscaping office. Let's talk about how I paid it off. Quietly. Anonymously. So Mom wouldn't have to sit at this table wondering if the bank was going to take everything you built." Eddie dropped his fork, his voice cracking as he said, "Wait, what? That wasn't Dad told me he handled that." I looked at him, my expression unchanged. "He didn't. I did. I bought the lien from the bank, then paid off the balance in full. I even mailed the paperwork to your P.O. box so you wouldn't ask questions. Frank's face had gone completely still, a kind of frozen rage mixed with embarrassment and maybe fear. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. And in that long, unbearable silence, I saw something I never thought I'd witness in him. Vulnerability. Not the performative kind, not the ranting or the yelling or the false humility, but the kind that comes when a person realizes they've been caught holding up a mirror and finally have to look into it. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I didn't offer forgiveness. I simply stood up from the table, set my napkin down gently beside my empty plate, and said, "You built a kingdom and taught us to bow. But you forgot that I was watching the whole time, and I learned not how to follow, but how to build something better." And with that, I walked out of the dining room and into the hallway, the weight of a lifetime of quiet sacrifice finally lifting from my shoulders. Behind me, no one moved. Not a single chair scraped. Not a single voice protested. Because for the first time in my life, the house was full of truth and none of them knew how to live in it. The air outside felt colder than it should have for early fall, that sharp kind of cold that doesn't necessarily sink into your bones, but rather rides the skin like a silent accusation, reminding you that no matter how many layers you wear or how many miles you put between yourself and the things you've outgrown, there are certain types of chill that only family can produce, and I felt it fully now, standing in the driveway of the house I grew up in, the house I once dreamed of escaping and now realized I had long since outgrown in every way that mattered. I didn't plan on staying long. I'd said my piece, maybe too much of it, and I knew from the way the silence had hung behind me like an echo that there was nothing else left to salvage at that dinner table except old pride and bitter air. I stood next to my car, the engine off, the keys in my coat pocket, trying to breathe through the storm that wasn't outside, but inside me slow and steady and strangely calm, like the kind of weather you know is going to break the trees before it lifts. I didn't expect anyone to follow me. I'd made my exit clean, sharp, surgical. But the front door creaked open behind me a few minutes later, and I heard the soft thud of my mother's shoes against the porch steps before she called out my name, not loudly, not urgently, but with a kind of weary tenderness that reminded me of every night she waited up when I was younger, pretending to read while secretly timing the sound of my car pulling into the driveway. I turned slowly to face her, watching her descend the stairs wrapped in that faded cardigan she always wore when she was nervous or cold or both, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. She reached me without making eye contact, crossing her arms tightly across her chest, then let out a sigh so long and so full of quiet devastation that it said more than any apology ever could. "I didn't know," she finally whispered, still looking off toward the street like the answer she needed might come from somewhere out in the dark. I mean, I knew something was wrong back then, when the bills started changing and he stopped letting me look at the statements, but I didn't. I didn't know how close it got. I nodded slowly, not as a confirmation but as a gesture of understanding, because that had always been her role, hadn't it? The quiet one, the peacemaker, the woman who saw the cracks but kept patching them with optimism and overcooked dinners and long-held silence. "I didn't do it to shame him," I said, my voice low and firm but not unkind. "I did it because I couldn't stand the thought of watching you lose everything just so he could keep pretending he hadn't already lost control." She turned her head then, finally meeting my eyes, and in hers I saw what I had suspected all along, not shock, not confusion, but a long, deep knowing. The kind that comes from years of looking the other way for the sake of harmony and realizing only too late that harmony bought with silence often becomes its own kind of prison. "I always knew you were strong," she said, her voice barely more than breath. "I just didn't realize you'd become this person. This woman who doesn't just survive but builds. Alone." It was meant to be a compliment, but something in it stung, because while I had built, and while I had survived, and while I had turned scraps into structure and doubt into dividends, there was a cost that came with that kind of independence, one I rarely admitted, even to myself. I smiled softly, though it wasn't joy that moved me. "I had to," I replied. "No one else was going to do it for me. I couldn't afford to wait for someone to hand me permission." She stepped closer then, and for the first time that night, she reached out and touched my arm, not to hold me back, not to guide me, but to simply make contact, as if her touch might tether us both to something that still mattered. "You were never small," she said, "even when they tried to make you feel that way." I let that settle for a moment, and in the quiet, I felt something else rise up, something I had been resisting all night, not anger, not sadness, but grief. Not because I'd said too much or because I feared the fallout, but because I realized that no matter how many buildings I bought, no matter how many spreadsheets I conquered or how many zeros followed the numbers in my account, there was still one thing I had never truly owned and probably never would: a seat at that table where I was seen for who I really was, not the daughter they thought they raised or the problem they quietly tolerated, but the woman I had become entirely on my own. "I didn't come tonight to prove anything," I said, stepping back slightly and looking once more at the house, which suddenly seemed so much smaller, so much more ordinary than the fortress of judgment I'd remembered. "I came because I was tired of pretending that silence was the same as respect. I came because I wanted to see if anything had changed." My mother nodded slowly, following my gaze to the windows glowing faintly behind drawn curtains. "Maybe it hasn't," she murmured. "But maybe it will. You shook something loose tonight, Natalie. Whether they admit it or not, they won't be able to go back to pretending." I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say, not now, not about this. I stepped toward my car, opened the door, and slid inside, and for a long second, I just sat there with my hands on the wheel, staring at the house that had raised me but never really known me, and felt the strange, unsteady ache of leaving a battlefield not with scars, but with clarity. As I turned the engine over and the headlights swept across the lawn, my mother raised a hand in farewell, not a wave, but a gesture, a kind of surrender, or maybe recognition, and I nodded once before pulling away, the tires whispering over gravel, the night swallowing up everything behind me. And as I drove into the darkness, past the sleepy houses and flickering porch lights and quiet streets of a town that never quite made space for me, I realized something else, something deeper. Success had never been about property or profit or even proving them wrong. It had always been about claiming something no one could ever repossess, not a deed, not a title, but the simple, unshakable truth that I had built myself from nothing, and I had done it without needing their applause. But still, somewhere deep down, I wished they had clapped.